You've got someone on your team right now who's working twice as hard as everyone else, not on the project, not on the deliverables, on pretending. Pretending the open plan office doesn't overwhelm them. Pretending the Monday stand-up makes sense when their brain needs to read information, not hear it. Pretending your feedback makes sense when they left the room with zero idea on what you wanted them to change. They haven't told you. They're not going to tell you. And every day you lead them with the same playbook that you use for everyone else, you lose a little more of what makes them your most valuable contributor. Today, we're talking about what it takes to lead neurodiverse adults at work, specifically people with ADHD and autism, and why everything that most leaders have been taught about supporting them is backward. Welcome to Toby Talks. I'm Toby Hoy, and this is where we dig deep into leadership, development, and process improvement for people who want to get better at all three. Today's episode is one I've been wanting to do for a while, and here's why. The more I work with leaders and teams, the more I see the same pattern repeating. A manager or leader comes to me and says something like, I've got this person who does incredible work, but they're inconsistent, or they're hard to read, or they don't engage in team settings the way I'd expect. And then when we start pulling on the thread, the issue isn't the person. The issue is the system. The team's processes, communication habits, and unwritten rules were all designed for one type of brain. And this person's brain doesn't match the template. Here's what makes this pattern so persistent. The leaders experiencing it are good leaders. They're not negligent. They're not uncaring. They want to help, but the tools that they've been given, the accommodation request form, the HR consultation, or the open door policy, they're all designed to treat the symptom and leave the cause untouched. And so the same pattern repeats across teams, companies, and industries, year after year, with talented people burning out in systems that were not built for them, while their leaders wonder what went wrong. Here's what we're going to cover in this episode. First, we're going to walk through why the standard approach to supporting neurodiverse employees, the accommodation model, absolutely fails most of the time. Secondly, we'll get specific about both ADHD and autism in the workplace, what they look like in adults, what leaders misread, and what to do instead. Thirdly, we'll talk about how to lead someone whose brain works differently from yours without waiting for them to come to you with a diagnosis and a formal request. And finally, we'll cover practical changes that you can make today to build a team environment where different cognitive styles don't need to hide. If you lead people, then this episode applies to you, even if no one on your team has disclosed a diagnosis, especially if nobody on your team has disclosed a diagnosis. Because the gap between what most leaders believe about neurodiversity and what the research shows is enormous. And the cost of that gap is measured in lost talent, preventable burnout, and unrealized potential sitting right there, 3 desks away from you. This episode is going to change how you think about leadership. I want to start with something uncomfortable. If you're a leader and you think you're supporting your neurodiverse team members because you've approved some accommodations through HR, I need you to stop and sit with this for a minute. Accommodations, the way that most organizations practice them, are designed to protect the company, not to develop the person. Let me explain what I mean by that. The standard accommodations process goes a little like this. An employee discloses a diagnosis or a challenge. HR gets involved. A list of adjustments gets created and documented. Things like extra time on deadlines, or a quieter workspace, or maybe permission to wear headphones, or flexible start times. All of those are prime examples. On paper, it looks like the company is doing the right thing, and legally it is. But from a leadership perspective, it's the bare minimum dressed up as generosity. Here's the problem with every single item on those lists. Every accommodation starts from the same assumption that the workplace is the standard and the person is the exception. The format of the meeting is fine. It's the person who needs an exception to it. The open plan office is fine, but the person needs an exception to it. The feedback process is fine, but the person needs an exception to it. But what if the meeting format isn't fine? What if it's a format that rewards fast verbal processing and penalizes anyone who needs some time to think before speaking? What if the open plan office format isn't productive for anybody and your neurodiverse employees are the only ones that are honest enough to say so? What if the feedback process loses half the room because it's all verbal and never followed up on in writing? I think about this a lot in terms of process design because, well, process is my wheelhouse. When a process fails for one person, I want to understand why. When a process fails for 15 to 20% of the people who use it, I stop asking, what's wrong with the people? And start asking, what's wrong with the process? And neurodiversity isn't rare. Conservative estimates say that 1 in 5 adults process information in ways the standard workplace wasn't built for. 1 in 5. On a team of 10, you've got 2 people operating in a system that is actively working against them. So the question isn't what accommodations does this person need? The better question is what's wrong with the process? I've talked to leaders who've approved dozens of accommodations over their careers, and I ask them the same thing every single time. After you approve the accommodation, did you change anything about how the team operates? And the answer, almost without exception, is no. The team keeps doing things the same way. The one person with the accommodation gets a workaround. And the workaround sends a clear, unmistakable message that you're the one who's different. We're fine. You're the exception. I worked with a team once where an autistic team member requested and received permission to skip the optional social events without it being noted in their performance review. And that sounds perfectly reasonable, doesn't it? The accommodation was approved. The box was checked. Done. But here's what nobody addressed. The team's culture informally rewarded attendance at those types of events. The people who showed up got mentioned in shoutouts. They got tapped for special projects. And they built relationships that drove career advancement. The accommodation said you don't have to attend, but the culture said if you don't attend, you're invisible. The accommodation protected the person from a formal penalty, but it didn't protect them from the informal cost of not conforming. The system stayed exactly the same. The person got a pass to sit outside of it. And sitting outside of the system isn't inclusion, it's exclusion with paperwork. Let me ask you something, and I want you to stop and think about this. If you were the person receiving the accommodation, how long before the workaround starts feeling like a label? How long before I get extra time on deadlines start sounding inside your own head like I'm slower than everyone else? Because the accommodation didn't change the standard. It confirmed it. And you are now officially on the outside of it. This is one of the reasons why masking is so pervasive. Masking, for anyone who's unfamiliar, is the process by which neurodiverse adults suppress their natural cognitive and behavioral patterns to appear neurotypical in professional settings. They force eye contact when it feels unnatural. They sit still in meetings when their bodies need movement. They pretend to follow verbal instructions, which they'll need to reread later. They laugh at the right times. They nod along at the right times and perform normal all day long. And that performance is exhausting, not metaphorically, physiologically exhausting. Masking depletes the same cognitive resources that are needed for the actual work. It creates chronic stress and drives anxiety. And it explains something that leaders see all the time, but misinterpret. The high performing neurodiverse employee who burns out or disengages after a period of strong output. They didn't burn out from the work. They burned out from performing normalcy on top of the work. That's two full-time jobs, one of them invisible. I want to take a minute and stop and be specific about what masking looks like day to day, because if you've never experienced it, you might underestimate its weight. Masking isn't one big performance. It's 1,000 micro adjustments happening every hour, hour after hour, day after day. It's the ADHD team member who set 5 silent alarms on their phone so they wouldn't lose track of time and miss your 2 p.m. meeting again. It's the autistic team member who practiced their casual greeting in the car before walking into the office, because the last time they walked in without saying hello or good morning to everyone, someone told them that they seemed cold. It's the person who wrote 3 different versions of the same one-paragraph Slack message, trying to hit the right tone, because the last time they sent a message without enough pleasantries and platitudes, someone read it as aggressive. Every one of those micro adjustments draws from the same cognitive budget that the person needs to do their actual work. And here's the absolute cruelest part. The better someone is at masking, the less you see the effort. The person on your team who seems fine is often the person working hardest to appear fine. They were masking, and then they ran out of capacity to keep masking. That crash was always coming. You just didn't see it because you weren't looking at the right indicators. If you take one thing from this first segment, let it be this. Stop asking, what accommodation does this person need? And start asking, what's wrong with the system requiring so many people to pretend? The first question puts the burden on the individual. The second question puts the burden where it belongs, on the process. Here's the hard truth, and I'm going to state it plainly. Your open door policy and flexible deadlines aren't support. They're band-aids slapped onto a system that was built exclusively for neurotypical brains. And they put the full burden of adaptation on the people who already spend half their energy masking just to survive in your environment. If you want to lead neurodiverse adults well, you need to stop patching the person and start fixing the system. Let me give you a frame of reference for the rest of the episode. When you break it down, there are 2 approaches to neurodiversity at work. The accommodation approach, which says the system is the default and the individual is the exception. So you make adjustments for the exception. The design approach says the system was built for one cognitive template. So redesign the system so it works for multiple templates by default without anyone needing to raise their hand or explain why they're different. Everything we're going to talk about for the rest of the episode comes from the design approach. Not because accommodations are bad in every case, but because they're insufficient. They're the floor, not the ceiling. And too many leaders treat them as the ceiling. So let's get specific about both of these things. And we'll start with ADHD. And I do want to clear something up right at the top, because most leaders have the wrong picture in their heads when they hear those 4 letters. ADHD in adults doesn't look like the TV or movie version of the kid who won't sit still. It doesn't look like the stereotype of someone bouncing off the walls, unable to focus on anything. In professional settings, adult ADHD looks like your highest potential team member who turns in exceptional strategy work, but 3 days late. It looks like the person who dominates a client presentation with energy and insight that nobody else in the room brings, and then disappears for a week and seems to be doing nothing. It looks like the colleague who sends you a brilliant analysis at 11:30 at night because their brain finally switched on after a full day of fighting to focus on tasks that their brain found unstimulating. Let me say this clearly. The name itself is misleading. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. The key word there being deficit, as if these brains don't have enough attention. The opposite is closer to the truth. People with ADHD don't lack attention. They lack voluntary control over where their attention goes. Their brains are interest-driven, not importance-driven. When something is novel, challenging, personally meaningful, or urgent, they will lock in to a state called hyperfocus, producing some of the best work that you'll ever see from anyone on your team. But when something is routine, abstract, or low stimulation, their brain deprioritizes it, not because they don't care, not because they're lazy, but because the neurological systems that govern task initiation, things like time estimation and priority sequencing, work differently in their brains. This distinction matters for you as a leader because it changes what you do about it. If you believe the issue is willpower, you offer motivation. Things like, come on, you've got this, or let's set some reminders. Versus if you understand the issue is neurological, you redesign the environment. It's a completely different response that delivers completely different results. The standard productivity advice that most leaders default to, things like break it into smaller steps, or make a to-do list, or set calendar reminders, completely misses the target for people with ADHD. And that's not because these are bad ideas. They work fine in neurotypical brains. They fall apart for ADHD brains because they assume that the person's executive function system works the way yours does. And it doesn't. If you've never heard the term executive function before, it's the set of cognitive skills that govern planning, organizing, initiating tasks, managing time, and holding information in working memory. In neurotypical brains, these systems operate relatively automatically. You see a task, estimate how long it'll take, and plan your approach, and then start it. For someone with ADHD, every one of those steps requires conscious effort, burns energy, and competes with a brain that is constantly scanning for more stimulating input. The to-do list doesn't fail because they forgot to make one. It fails because looking at a list of low stimulation tasks doesn't trigger the initiation signal that their brain requires. And here's the part that people don't talk about enough: the emotional cost. When you struggle with executive function, you know you're struggling. You know the report is due. You know that you should start it. You want to start it. And you sit at your desk for 2 hours, brain simply refusing to engage and hating yourself the entire time. You're not lazy. You're not choosing to avoid the work. Your initiation system isn't firing the way it needs to, and no amount of willpower will change the neurochemistry. What changes are the environment, the structure, and a leader who understands the difference between a motivation problem and a design problem. I've seen leaders handle this one of two ways. The first way is they see a struggling team member, assume that effort is the issue, and respond with pressure. Things like, I need you to prioritize this. It was due yesterday. And then that pressure adds stress. The stress further impairs executive function, and the person spirals. Versus the second way, they see a struggling team member, recognize the pattern, and respond with structure. Things like, let's break this into 3 pieces. Send me the first piece by Thursday. We'll review it together and then decide on the next steps. The structure provides the external scaffolding that the brain needs. The stress drops and the work gets done. All of that was the same person, the same project, and the same deadline, but different leadership and a different outcome. So what do? Research shows that there are 3 things that work relatively consistently, and I want to walk you through each one. The first is to externalize the executive function. This is the single biggest shift that you need to make. Stop expecting your ADHD team member to hold priorities, sequences, and deadlines in their head, and start making those things visible and physical. Things like a shared Kanban board with task status color-coded, or a daily 10-minute sync where you verbally confirm what's happening today. Not what happened yesterday, not what's planned for next week, but today. Or a shared document where priorities are ranked and updated in real time. You're not micromanaging here. You're providing external scaffolding for a brain that doesn't generate internal scaffolding the same way that yours does. And that difference matters. Think of it like this. If someone has poor eyesight, you don't tell them to squint harder. You give them glasses. Externalizing executive function is giving someone cognitive glasses. It puts the structure where they need it, outside of their head, visible, tangible, and shared. Second thing is to compress the timeline. Now, I know this sounds backwards. You're thinking that if someone struggles with deadlines, to just give them some more time. That sounds right, but it's wrong. For ADHD brains, longer deadlines create worse outcomes. A 2-week deadline sits in the abstract zone for 13 days. It doesn't feel real. It doesn't trigger urgency. Then on day 14, a panic response kicks in, and they produce the work in a frantic burst, costing them sleep, quality, and mental health. And then you, the leader, see the late stage scramble and think the problem is time management. It's not. The problem is the deadline was too far away for it to feel real until it wasn't. The fix here is to replace the 2-week assignment with a series of 3-day sprints, smaller deliverables, more frequent check-ins, tighter feedback loops. Urgency stays active, but without the crash. Output quality goes up and energy stays consistent, and the person stops white-knuckling their way through cycles of avoidance and panic. I want to add a little something here about how to have this conversation with a team member, because I know what you're thinking. If I shorten their deadline, won't they feel micromanaged? And the answer is not if you frame it correctly. You're not shortening the deadline because you don't trust them. You're restructuring the workflow because smaller iterations produce better results. Frame it as a process improvement, not a performance intervention. Things like, I want to try something different with this project. Instead of 1 deliverable in 2 weeks, let's break it into 3 checkpoints. I want to see your thinking as you go so that I can offer input earlier, not a correction later. That's the same outcome, but a completely different signal. The other thing to understand about ADHD and deadlines is the relationship between urgency and quality. When someone with ADHD hits a deadline-driven focus state, the work they produce is often exceptional. The problem isn't with the quality of the output. The problem is the cost of getting there. The crash afterward, the sleep lost, the stress accumulated. These are unsustainable. Sprint formatting doesn't reduce the intensity, it distributes it. Instead of one volcanic eruption of productivity, you get a steady series of controlled burns. Same fire, manageable heat. And third is to measure the output, not the process. This one requires you to confront something about yourself. When someone delivers exceptional work in a way that doesn't match your process, what do? Do you evaluate the work or do you critique the path that they took to get there? ADHD brains find their own routes to the finish line, and those routes don't always look linear. They don't always look organized. They involve late nights, tangential exploration, and a mess of browser tabs. And the end product is often extraordinary. Your job as a leader is to care about the destination. Let the route they take be theirs. Now, let's make this concrete with an example. Picture Toby's taco truck. Opening day of a busy holiday weekend. 3 crew members on the line. And every morning, I run a 5-minute stand-up meeting. Old school format. Go around the circle. Each person answers 3 questions. What did you do yesterday? What's your plan for today? And is anything blocking you? Simple, clean. Works great in textbooks. 2 of my crew members handle it fine. The third one, my best line cook, the person whose speed and precision keep the line moving at lunch rush, freezes up every single time. She knows what she needs to do. She's mapped the entire shift in her head. But when I put her on the spot to verbalize it in sequence in front of 2 other people with 0 prep time, her brain scrambles. She gives a vague answer, mumbles something about prepping the proteins. I walk away thinking she's unprepared. She walks away thinking that she's failing. And in this scenario, nobody wins. So one Monday, I changed the format. Instead of a verbal go around the circle, I put a whiteboard by the prep station. When each crew member clocks in, they write their 3 priorities for the shift on the board. And then we review the board together for 2 minutes. It's the same information, no spotlight and no verbal processing under pressure. And here's what happens. My line cook, the one who froze in every stand-up, starts writing the clearest, most detailed shift plans of anyone on the crew. Protein rotation, station timing, prep sequences for the rush window, all of it laid out in her handwriting on a whiteboard. Writing is where her brain organizes best. I've been forcing her to perform in a format that penalized her processing style. And when I removed the penalty, her brilliance showed up instantly. The whiteboard took 10 minutes to set up. It cost me a trip to the office supply store and about $40. And it didn't accommodate one person. It made every morning on the truck better for all of us. Here's what's important about that story. I didn't ask my line cook, do you have ADHD? Do you need an accommodation? I observed a process that was failing for a team member and then fixed the process. I noticed the format was the problem, not the person. And the fix I implemented didn't single a single person out. It became the new standard for everyone. Nobody needed a diagnosis. Nobody needed a disclosure. Nobody needed to feel different. The process changed, and the results improved across the board. This is the difference between the accommodations mindset and the design mindset. Accommodations ask the person to explain why they're different. Design asks the leader to build something better. One of those requires vulnerability from the employee. The other requires humility on the part of the leader. I know which one I'd rather bet on. Bottom line, leaders don't manage brains. They design systems, letting different brains win. Now let's move on to autism. And I want to approach this with the same directness as we did ADHD, because the misunderstandings here run even deeper, and the consequences for autistic professionals are significant. First, let's clear the table of the stereotypes. The media image of autism, the socially awkward genius, the person who won't make eye contact, or the savant with no emotional range, describes a narrow slice of the autism spectrum. Many autistic adults in professional settings are socially skilled, empathetic, and effective communicators. They've spent years, sometimes decades, learning the social rules of the neurotypical world through conscious effort. They have painstakingly built internal rule books for small talk, body language, email tone, meeting behavior, and professional self-presentation. And all of that is exhausting, not annoying, not tiring, exhausting at a neurological level. And here's why. The core difference in autism isn't a lack of social ability, it's the processing cost of social interaction. Neurotypical brains handle social cues automatically, below conscious awareness. You read a room without trying. You adjust your tone mid-sentence based on someone's facial expression without making a decision to do so. You pick up on sarcasm, subtext, and emotional shifts through pattern recognition running in the background of your cognition. Autistic brains process the same information manually through learned rules and pattern recognition running in the foreground, consciously, deliberately. Every smile decoded, every tone of voice is analyzed, every pause in a conversation is interpreted through a rulebook built from years of observation and practice. The result looks the same on the outside. An autistic colleague in a meeting appears engaged, responsive, and socially fluent, but the cognitive cost is enormous. They're running every social calculation consciously, the way you and I would run long division on paper, while someone else does it in their head. We get to the same answer, but with 10 times the effort. This means an autistic team member who nails a client meeting and seems totally comfortable might go home and need 3 hours of silence to recover. They're not antisocial. They're not disengaged. They're cognitively depleted from running every social interaction through manual processing for an hour. The second dimension leaders need to understand is sensory processing. And this is where the work environment itself becomes the obstacle. Most neurotypical adults filter out background noises, flickering lights, ambient temperature changes, or the scent of a coworker's lunch without any conscious effort. Your brain files these inputs as irrelevant and then suppresses them. Many autistic adults either don't have this automatic filter or have a less effective one. Every sensory input competes for processing bandwidth. The hum of the HVAC system, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, the colleague tapping a pen 3 desks away. All of these register at the same priority level as the work itself. An open plan office with overhead fluorescents, a chatty team, or the double volume commercials interrupting the background music on the radio station every 19 minutes, and an HVAC system cycling on and off every 12 minutes is, for some autistic professionals, the equivalent of trying to write a report while someone plays drums in the next room. This is not a preference issue. It's a bandwidth issue. The sensory load eats into the same cognitive resource needed for the actual work. And the tricky part for leaders is this: the sensory experience is invisible to you. You walk into the same office and your brain automatically filters out the fluorescent hum, the keyboard clatter, and the ambient conversation. Your team member walks into the same office and their brain treats all of those inputs as foreground information that requires active processing. You're working in the same room, but experiencing fundamentally different environments. And the gap between your experience and theirs is the gap that you need to close with design. Let me give you a specific scenario. You've got a team member producing outstanding analytical work. Their reports are thorough, their logic is airtight, and the recommendations save the company money every quarter. But they have a pattern you've noticed. They do their best work from home on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on their in-office days, their output drops. You've considered whether they're just phoning it in on office days and wondered why they appear less committed than you thought. Here's what's happening under the surface. On home days, they control the sensory environment. They choose things like the lighting, the noise level, and the temperature. Their full cognitive bandwidth goes to the work. Compare that to the office days. 20 to 30% of their cognitive bandwidth gets consumed by managing sensory input that they don't control. The fluorescent lights, the open plan noise, the perfume from the person 2 desks over. Their output drops, not because their effort drops, but because they have less processing power available for the work itself. They're running the same software on a machine with 30% less RAM. Once you understand this, the solution is obvious. Protect their home days. Designate quiet zones in the office. Offer noise-canceling headphones as standard equipment, not a special request. Swap their desk from the center of the open plan to a corner with fewer visual or auditory distractions. None of those changes requires disclosure, but all of them require observation and empathy from the leader. Here's what leaders often do instead of understanding this. They see strong performance one week and exhaustion the next. They see someone who's brilliant in structured interactions and absent in unstructured ones. They connect the dots and conclude that this person is struggling. Their role is too demanding. They need either a lighter load or a different role. And that's simply wrong. They're not struggling with the work. They're struggling with the environment that you've put the work inside of. Change the environment and you'll see performance you didn't know was possible. Just like with ADHD, let me give you 3 practical moves. Practical move number 1 is to say what you mean every time. Indirect communication is the enemy of efficient cognitive processing for autistic team members. Things like, it would be great if someone took a look at the numbers before Friday, is a fog machine. Who is someone? Which numbers? What does take a look mean? A quick scan? A full audit? A presentation? Every piece of ambiguity costs cognitive energy because the person has to decode the subtext that your brain processes automatically. Replace that with direct, specific, complete communication. Things like, Maria, please review the third quarter expense report for variances over 5% and send me a 1-page summary by Thursday at noon. There's nothing rude about it, nothing condescending about it. It's clear. And here's the thing, every single person on your team benefits from clear instructions. Not one team member in the history of work has ever said, I wish my boss was more vague. Practical move number 2, provide written context before meetings. Send the agenda at least 1 business day in advance. And I don't mean a list of topics. Fourth quarter budget discussion isn't an agenda. It's a category. Decide on fourth quarter marketing budget allocation. Approve the $50,000 digital proposal or redirect funds to events is an agenda item. It tells people what is happening, what decision needs to be made, and what they need to do to prepare. For autistic team members, this advanced written context is transformative. It gives them time to organize their thoughts, prepare their input, and arrive ready to contribute rather than spending the first 15 minutes trying to figure out what the meeting is about. And again, this helps your entire team. Meetings with clear agendas and defined outcomes are shorter, sharper, and more productive for everyone. And number 3 is to respect transitions. Unexpected changes are disproportionately costly for autistic professionals. And here's why. When an autistic person sits down to start a focused work block, they've often spent significant cognitive energy building a mental framework for that task. They've organized the steps, anticipated the challenges, and allocated their processing bandwidth. A last-minute meeting invite doesn't just cost them 30 minutes. It costs them the entire framework that they've built, which they'll need to rebuild again from scratch when they return to that task. And often this is where I get the most pushback from leaders. Everyone deals with interruptions. It's part of working on a team. And that's true. Everyone does deal with them, but the cost isn't equal. For a neurotypical worker, an unexpected meeting is an annoyance at best. They context switch, attend the meeting, and return to their original task with just a few minutes of reorientation. For an autistic team member, the context switch isn't a transition. It's a complete demolition and a rebuild. Their brain doesn't slide between tasks. It disassembles one framework and constructs another one from the ground up. Every surprise meeting, every got a minute, every last second Zoom link costs them exponentially more cognitive energy than it costs you. Understanding this doesn't mean eliminating interruptions. It means being intentional about them. Batch your meetings together. Protect deep work blocks and ask before interrupting a focus period rather than assuming everyone is equally interruptible. And when a disruption is necessary, own it. Things like, I know you were in the middle of something and I'm pulling you out of it, but here's why it matters and roughly how long I think it'll take. Acknowledging the cost respects the person's process. Ignoring it tells them that their process doesn't matter to you. Wherever possible, protect calendar predictability. Give advance notice of changes. Batch meetings together so that uninterrupted work blocks stay uninterrupted. And when a change is unavoidable, acknowledge it. I know this wasn't planned, and I'm sorry for the disruption. That sentence costs you nothing and takes 5 seconds, and it signals respect for their process. Now, I want to connect both ADHD and autism through something that leaders rarely see, and that's masking, because masking is the common thread running through both. And it's the single biggest threat to your neurodiverse team members' longevity. For autistic adults, masking means scripting conversations in advance, forcing eye contact when it feels unnatural, and performing emotions the way that they've learned neurotypical people expect. It means smiling when the social rules say smile, even when the urge isn't there. It means suppressing the need to stim, to move, to look away, to process silently, because all of those natural behaviors have either been punished or pathologized since childhood. For adults with ADHD, masking means sitting still when every nerve needs movement. It means pretending to track along in a meeting that their brain tuned out of 10 minutes ago. It means holding the chaos of their process behind a curated exterior of organization. It means arriving at 8:59 in the morning with a coffee and a calm face after a morning that involved 3 lost items and a forgotten lunch and a meltdown in the car that they'll never tell you about. Masking works for a while, and then it breaks. And when it breaks, it doesn't break gracefully. It breaks as burnout, anxiety, depression, or sudden disengagement that blindsides the leader who thought everything was fine. I had no idea they were struggling, you'll say, and you'll mean it because masking is invisible by design. That's the whole point. I want to give you the warning signs because by the time the masking breaks down, you've already lost. The early indicators are subtle. A team member who used to volunteer for extra projects starts to decline them, not because they're less committed, but because they're rationing their energy. Someone who used to stay for after-work social events stops attending, not because they don't value the team, but because the social performance required to attend those events takes energy, and they'll need that energy for the next workday. Someone's sick days increase, not because they're physically ill, but because they need recovery days from the sustained effort of performing normalcy in a neurotypical environment. None of those things are character flaws. They're cognitive strategies. The person is triaging their finite cognitive resources, cutting non-essential expenditures to preserve enough capacity for the actual work. And if you see these patterns and respond with well, they're not as engaged as they used to be, instead of something about the environment is costing this person more than it should, you'll lose them, not to a competitor, but to exhaustion. The alternative is straightforward. Build an environment where the performance pressure is on the work, not on the person's behavior around the work, where someone is evaluated by the quality of their output, not by how they hold their face during a meeting, where different ways of processing, communicating, and working are treated as features of a diverse team, not problems to be smoothed over. If you want to lead neurodiverse adults well, you need to make your team a place where masking is unnecessary, where someone doesn't have to perform normalcy to be valued, where the work speaks louder than the behaviors surrounding the work. To sum this all up in a single sentence, inclusion isn't a policy. It's the absence of pressure to pretend. So let's wrap this up with talking about leading without a diagnosis that's on the table. And this is often the place where most leaders get stuck. They hear everything that I've said so far and they nod along. And then the first question out of their mouth is, but what if nobody on my team has told me that they have ADHD or autism? How do I know who I'm supposed to help? My answer almost every time is it doesn't matter. And here's why. The majority of neurodiverse adults in the workforce don't disclose. The research on this is detailed and consistent across multiple countries and industries. People don't share their diagnoses at work because the professional risks outweigh the potential benefits. They've seen colleagues treated differently after disclosing. They've watched peers get passed over for promotions after the words ADHD or autism entered their personnel file. They've internalized the message, reinforced by every accommodation they've ever received, telling them that different means less. And here's the other piece that people forget. Many neurodiverse adults don't have a diagnosis at all. ADHD in women has been systematically undiagnosed for decades. Autism in adults who learn to mask effectively as children often goes undiagnosed, well into their 30s or 40s if it's ever diagnosed at all. The person on your team showing every pattern I've described in this episode might not have a word for it yet. They know something is different. They've always known, but they don't have the label, the paperwork, or the formal accommodation request that you're waiting for. So if you're sitting in your office thinking that nobody on my team has disclosed, so this doesn't apply to me, I need you to rethink that. It applies to you more than you realize. The people who need these changes are not the ones likely to ask for them. Let me paint a picture of what this looks like in practice. You've got a team of 8. You've never had anyone disclose ADHD or autism. You run a well-organized team with regular meetings, clear goals, and a supportive culture. You think you're doing well, but here's what you're not seeing. Your project coordinator, the one who does flawless work, but always seems stressed, she's spending 45 minutes every morning organizing her tasks into a system that neurotypical productivity gurus recommend. And the system doesn't work for her brain, but she doesn't have a word for why. She thinks she's bad at time management, and she's not. She's just using someone else's cognitive tools. Your senior developer, the one who always delivers clean code but never speaks in sprint retrospectives. He's not disengaged. He's processing. His brain needs 12 to 15 seconds to formulate a verbal response to an unexpected question. Your retrospective moves too fast. By the time he's organized his thoughts, the conversation has moved on. He goes home feeling invisible. You go home thinking he doesn't care. Your marketing lead, the one who sends emails at midnight with brilliant campaign ideas, she's not a workaholic. Her brain's most creative window opens after 10 p.m. She's been fighting it for 15 years, forcing herself to work 9 to 5 and producing mediocre output during the day. And then doing her best work, her real work, after everyone else is asleep. She's not exhausted because she works too much, but because she works twice, once for appearances and once for real. None of these people has ever disclosed anything. None of them might ever disclose anything, but every one of them would perform better, feel better, and stay longer if you redesigned three small things about how your team operates. Number one, written task management systems instead of verbal ones. Number two, asynchronous retrospective channels alongside the live ones. And number three, flexible schedules evaluated by output, not by hours. This is why the design approach matters so much more than the accommodations approach. You don't need a diagnosis to redesign your meeting format. You don't need a disclosure to start sending written agendas. You don't need a formal request to offer multiple channels instead of insisting everything happens over Slack. You don't need paperwork to shorten a deadline or add a written follow-up channel after meetings. Design for the spectrum and you help everyone on it, disclosed or not, diagnosed or not, neurodiverse or neurotypical. Because, and I'll keep saying this until it sticks, every single one of these changes improves the working environment for your entire team. But beyond systems, there's a relational piece here. And this is where leadership, the kind you don't learn from an HR compliance training, comes in. You need to build a team culture where people feel safe being different without having to explain why. This doesn't require a grand gesture or a company-wide initiative. It requires you, the leader, to do a handful of small things consistently over time. Let me give you four. Number one is to stop rewarding sameness. If you praise the team member who speaks up first in every meeting and overlook the one who sends you a detailed analysis by email an hour later, you're rewarding processing speed rather than quality. You're telling your team the insights delivered live in the room are the only ones I value. Everything else is an afterthought. Fix this. Follow-up meetings with a written channel for additional input. A simple message that if you have thoughts that were not voiced in the meeting, reply to this thread by the end of the day. And then credit those contributions the same way that you credit the in-room input. Mention them in your next team update. Reference them in your decisions. Show your team the insights arriving after the meeting matter as much as the ones arriving during it. Number two, normalize differences in work style. When someone on your team works in a non-traditional pattern, don't frame it as an exception requiring explanation. Sarah does her best work early in the morning, so she starts at 6 and logs off after 3 is a statement of fact, not a concession. Saying it matter-of-factly without attaching it to a diagnosis or a formal accommodation signals something important, that this team values output over optics. The more you normalize variation, the less anyone needs to hide. And hiding is what kills performance, not difference. Here's a question to test whether your team culture is safe for cognitive difference. Would a team member feel comfortable telling you, unprompted, about a non-standard way they prefer to work? Not in an accommodation request form, not in a formal HR meeting, in a regular, one-on-one, casually, the way they'd mention a preference for a standing desk or a different color of pen. If the answer is no, the culture isn't safe enough yet. And the fix starts with how you, the leader, respond to the first person brave enough to say something different. Number three is to ask better questions in one-on-ones. Here's a question that most leaders ask in every one-on-one meeting. How's it going? It's well-intentioned. It's also worthless for neurodiverse team members. How's it going is too vague to process meaningfully. The answer is almost always fine or good because the question doesn't provide enough structure for an honest answer. It's the meeting equivalent of how are you at the grocery store? It's a social ritual, not a real inquiry. Try one of these instead. What's one thing about how we run projects making your work harder than it needs to be? Or is there a communication format that works better for you than what we're doing now? Or when you think about your best workday last month, what made it work? What was different about the environment, the tasks, or the schedule? Those questions are specific, they're answerable, and they invite honesty without requiring disclosure. And those answers will teach you more about leading your team members than a year of how's it going conversations. Let me tell you what happens when you start asking these questions consistently. You learn things, useful things. One team member tells you that meetings before 10 a.m. are unproductive for her because her meds don't kick in until mid-morning. They didn't disclose a diagnosis. They simply told you a scheduling fact. Another team member tells you that they do their best thinking on paper, not on screens, and asks if they handwrite their project plans and then take photos of them instead of using the project management tool. They didn't ask for an accommodation. They told you their best process. A third team member tells you that the weekly all hands meeting drains their entire afternoon because of the social energy that it requires. They didn't say they're autistic. They gave you data about their productivity patterns. None of these conversations required anyone to label themselves. All of them gave you actionable information about how to better lead each person. And all of them happened because you asked a specific question instead of a generic one. This is relational leadership for neurodiverse teams in a nutshell. You don't need a diagnosis. You need curiosity, specific questions, and the willingness to adjust when the answers tell you something isn't working. And number 4 is to check your assumptions about professionalism. Here's a big one. Does your unwritten code define professionalism as maintaining eye contact during conversations, replying to email promptly within the hour, showing enthusiasm in group settings, and keeping your desk tidy? I want you to look at each of those behaviors and ask yourself, is this a job requirement or a neurotypical behavior norm that I've mistaken for one? Eye contact is not a measure of engagement. Email response speed is not a measure of commitment. Enthusiasm in group settings is not a measure of team investment. And desk tidiness is not a measure of competence. Every one of those behaviors is not an outcome. And when you evaluate people by behaviors rather than outcomes, you're not managing performance. You're enforcing conformity. Separate what the role demands from what your culture has normalized. Rewrite your expectations as outcomes, not behaviors. Delivers client reports meeting quality standards by the agreed deadline is an expectation. Maintains a professional appearance and responds promptly to all communications is a dress code for cognition. And here's the uncomfortable extension of this idea. If your performance review system evaluates communication skills or teamwork or executive presence without defining those terms as specific, measurable outcomes, you are, right now, penalizing neurodiverse team members for being neurodiverse. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but structurally, because those vague descriptions default to neurotypical behavior norms in the mind of whoever's doing the evaluation. Want to fix this one? Define every evaluation criterion as something that you measure from the work itself, not from observing the person's behavior while doing the work. Communication skills becomes stakeholders report receiving timely, accurate project updates. Teamwork becomes contributed to 3 cross-functional initiatives and met all collaboration deliverables. Executive presence gets deleted entirely because it's a subjective assessment of how someone looks and sounds and has nothing to do with the quality of their leadership. I want to close out the main content with something that you walk away with today. Not theory, not principles. 7 changes that you can implement starting right now. Each one takes less than an hour to set up, costs nothing, and benefits every person on your team. I'm giving you 7 because I want you to pick 3. Not all 7 at once, 3. Start there, get them running, see the results, and then add more. The goal isn't to overhaul your entire team in a week. The goal is to start moving in the right direction and build momentum from small wins. So here's the list. Number one, send written agendas for every meeting at least one business day in advance. Not topic lists, outcome based agendas. This gives every brain on your team a chance to prepare and leads to shorter, better meetings. Number two, replace one verbal only process with a written first process. Pick the meeting or handoff where you've seen the most confusion. Add a written component, a whiteboard, a shared doc, a 5-minute pre read, something. You'll see immediate improvement in both clarity and follow through. Number three is to shorten one long deadline. Take your longest current project assignment and break it into 3 or 5 day sprints with check ins. Don't add more work. Break the same work into smaller processes with more frequent touch points. Watch what happens to both output and energy. Number four is to make all communication explicit for 1 week. End every assignment with 3 things. Here's what I need, here's the format I want it in, and here's the deadline. No assumptions, no subtext, no, you know what I mean. Full clarity every time. After a week, decide whether to keep going or not. I'll bet, but you will. Because here's what you'll notice. The people who always seem to get it without explicit instructions were doing interpretive work that you never saw. They were guessing what you meant and getting lucky. When you remove the guesswork, everyone's output improves because nobody is wasting cognitive energy trying to decode your intentions. Number five is to add a written follow-up channel after meetings. After your next team meeting, send a message. If you have thoughts not shared in the meeting, reply here by the end of the day. And then treat those contributions with the same weight as the in-room input. Credit them publicly and reference them in decisions. Number six, audit your workplace for sensory load. Walk through your team's work environment and note 4 things: lighting intensity, ambient noise level, availability of quiet options, and visual clutter. You don't need to redesign the office. Identify one thing that you would change or one option you would offer. A lamp instead of overhead lights. A quiet room bookable for deep work. A standing invitation to wear headphones without any judgment. And number seven, rewrite one performance expectation as an outcome, not a behavior. Find a place in your review criteria where you're evaluating how someone works instead of what they produce. These 7 ideas are small in isolation. None of them will transform your team overnight, but together they signal something profound: that this is a place where different brains are welcome, not just tolerated, not accommodated as a special case, but welcome structurally by design. And one more thing about these 7 change ideas: notice what they all have in common. None of them require you to know who's neurodiverse and who isn't. None of them singles anyone out. None of them needs a diagnosis, a disclosure, or an HR form. They are universal design decisions that improve the operating system of your team for everyone who runs on it. When the floor rises for different cognitive styles, the ceiling rises for the whole team. Let's bring this all together to close out. Neurodiversity isn't a special category of employee. It's a description of how 1 in 5 human brains work. Your team has neurodiverse members right now, whether you know it or not. The accommodations model treats neurodiversity as an exception to be managed. It puts the burden on the individual to adapt to your system. It works on paper and fails in practice because it never addresses the real problem. Your system was built for one type of brain. Leading neurodiverse adults means redesigning your process, communication norms, and definition of professionalism so that different cognitive cycles don't have to hide to belong. It means externalizing executive function for the ADHD team members. It means providing clarity and predictability for autistic team members. And it means doing all of this by default, not by request. The 7 changes we discussed earlier are not accommodations. They're upgrades. Every one of them makes your team better for every brain in the room. You don't need to know who's neurodiverse. You don't need anyone to raise their hand. You need to build a system where different doesn't mean difficult, and where the quality of someone's work matters more than whether their process looks like yours. You don't need a diagnosis. You don't need a disclosure. You need the willingness to question the assumptions that are baked into every process your team runs, and the discipline to change the ones that only the default brain works for. The system isn't broken for them. It was never built for them. Build better. And here's the last thing I want to leave you with before we wrap. None of this is charity. None of this is about being a nice leader or checking a diversity box. This is about performance. The neurodiverse members of your team bring cognitive strengths that neurotypical team members don't have. Pattern recognition, systematic thinking, hyper-focused problem solving, deep analytical capability, creative connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. These are all examples of competitive advantages hiding in plain sight on your roster, buried under a system penalizing anyone who doesn't think the way the system was designed to expect. When you design for neurodiversity, you don't lose anything. You gain access to capacity that you've been wasting. You stop burning out your best people, and you build a team culture where honesty replaces performance, where output replaces optics, and where the best idea wins, regardless of the package it arrives in. The business case is there. The ethical case is there. The question is whether you're willing to look at your system, admit it was never built for everyone, and do the work to change it. I think you are if you're still listening. So let's go. And with all of that said, if this one hit home, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment down below. Drop by the blog post at toby-talks.com and let me know what changes you're making. Share this episode with a leader who needs to hear it. And if you are someone who's been masking at work, spending all of your energy performing normalcy while doing exceptional work behind the scenes, I see you, and you deserve better from your leaders. And some of them are starting to get it. I'm Toby Hoy, and this is Toby Talks. Until next time, go lead, go improve, and go grow.